Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm here with two colleagues today, Alistair Rieu-Clarke and Elisa Morgera. This is an event, a partnership between Milaré Advogados and VX. So it will be, this content is being prepared for Coral. Well, Alistair, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourself very quickly, but just so you understand why I wanted to brought the two of you here. Alistair has been a colleague and a friend for almost 15 years. We sort of grew up together in the global water world, so it's very nice to have you here, especially since we haven't had a chance to work together in a while. And Elisa is a new colleague for me, although I've known her work for many years, known and admired. And Elisa, you were so gracious to accept my connection on LinkedIn, even though we hadn't been properly introduced. So that was very nice. And once again, thank you both for accepting this invitation. So first of all, we're getting just Thanksgiving for some countries. We're just past it, and soon enough is Christmas. So from the perspective of international environmental law and the areas that you are more focused on, what should we be grateful in 2021 that will carry us on for into 2022? Alistair, please.
Yes, thanks, Flavia. Thanks for the introduction. I mean, I would say, I mean, just to say a bit about my background, and I come a little bit tunnel visioned to these things because I am focused on water, but well, you know, water cuts across so many different sectors. But I do see things. Yeah, I guess I'm exposed to water. What's happening in water more than other fields, so I'm perhaps a little bit biased in that respect. I suppose the other thing I'm working on are the SDGs and looking at the monitoring and reporting under the SDGs. And I still think, I mean, we can criticize the SDGs. Maybe we've got, you know, we've not got the right ones. The emphasis isn't right. But what I do think we have is a really concerted effort to monitor progress around the SDGs through the reporting and the indicators. So I'll be Scottish and I'll start with the bad news, which is that I think across the SDGs we've taken a hit with the COVID pandemic. You can see how that's really had a horrible impact on progress across sustainable development goals. But I also see sort of encouraging signs that at least there's a lot of effort around the data drive and trying to report on all of the indicators related to the SDGs. And again, as I said at the beginning, I'm really only mostly looking at seeing what's happening in the water and through UN water repair efforts. But you can see that there is this concerted effort for countries to better understand where the gaps are, and you can also see it's still early days, but certainly for the data drives. But you can see that there's also a little shift in terms of where we focus our attention and where we build on what the data and the reporting is telling us. So to me, that's a positive.
Just a quick comeback to you, Ali, because I read the previous UN Water report on the SDG, the target, the indicator on transboundary. I haven't read the last one. Are we doing better than in 2018 for transboundary?
I mean, the general message, I mean, so I'm focused on the positives. I see we're doing better in terms of number of countries reporting. So now we have more than 80% of countries that share transboundary waters are reporting on their transboundary waters, which I think is incredible. If you'd asked me before the indicator had been developed, whether we would have that rate of response, that number of countries reporting, well, first I'd probably say really we're going to have a countries are going to agree at the global level on an indicator on transboundary cooperation. But aside from that, I would say, wow, it's going to be a real struggle to get anywhere near the majority of countries reporting. And some of these reports, they're running to over 100 pages. You can find them on the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. The Water Convention's website has the reports from the first and second exercise. So I think we see super positive in terms of countries engaging with that process, and you can see from the first report to the second report that the quality is getting a little bit better. First time round, we saw a lot of gaps around aquifers, aquifer data, even just basic data on shared aquifers. But we can see that that's now getting a little bit more improved in these national reports. So I think that's positive. I think, in terms of the end goal, having coverage of operational arrangements for transboundary waters across the world, it's still not. I mean, we have an awful lot to do. The majority of basins, the majority of countries don't have 100% of their basins covered, or anywhere near 100% of their basins covered by operational arrangements. So there's a lot to do, but also, at least I think, a bit more focused attention on terms of where these basins are, what action can be done. UN Water has their acceleration framework, putting in place some key factors, drivers for accelerating progress, financing, data information, capacity development. Sorry?
At least from the reporting side, things are moving forward, which is a nice basis to get the end goal.
It's not moving fast enough, but at least you can see some positives.
Good. Elisa, you've worked a lot on oceans, and I've written your material, and it's very rich, especially the intersection with benefit sharing, which also has huge importance, and it's very discussed within international water law. So for this year, what are you grateful that you saw happening at, for example, the climate COP or other good news that we've had on oceans for this year?
Well, thank you. I think it's really good to reflect and take maybe the positive lens on these developments. And maybe just to say also, as a person based in Scotland, of course, our life have been dominated by COP26. And I think one definitely thing to be grateful for is how much international attention, international across different sectors of society, international attention in the media was really focused on the need for climate action. At COP26, there was also the first official inclusion of the ocean in the future of work of the international climate change regime. And this, may come a bit late compared to, what we know already about the interactions between the ocean and climate. But at the same time, the international community and researchers were present en masse from the ocean side to really be ready to offer support for better integrating the ocean into climate mitigation and adaptation. And so there's a big opportunity, I think, for business to build on that science that's already out there and be perhaps even ahead of the game in terms of international policy in looking at that nexus of climate change in the ocean, and think about smart investments, the importance of finance on these issues, but also due diligence. And I guess maybe the second area for which I'm grateful for, which I think is really essential to bring into our thinking around the ocean climate nexus, is human rights. So this year was the year in which the Human Rights Council recognized for the first time an international human right to a healthy environment. This is not a new right, because in fact it builds on our existing international human rights and relevant obligation. It's just that our understanding from a science and legal perspective of how our very basic human needs depend on a healthy environment, including safe climate and healthy ocean, how they're indispensable and intrinsically linked. So just a recognition of something that's already out there as a matter of international law. But it's really important to even focus more efforts on the work in that nexus And of course, in the context of the climate regime, we've done a lot of work already on climate justice. So once again, from a business perspective, that understanding that human rights play a huge role in climate action and ocean action really becomes also a matter for due diligence for business, and an important guide to identify sustainable investment and action. And perhaps linked to that, there's more and more attention to specifically the human rights of children to a healthy environment. New work at the UN has been launched to develop guidance on how protecting human rights of the child needs to depend on our protection of the environment and marine environment. And this really provides, I think, a whole set of tools about taking a longer term approach to understanding the impacts of our choices on the use of the environment and the implications they may have on the life of those that will live longer on Earth, that may be those taking those decisions. And so once again, I think this is really an important insight, both in terms of planning, but also in terms of the tools we use for assessing risks, for planning, how we engage different sectors of society to understand which business decisions, as well as public authorities, licensing and monitoring, how they need to take that longer term perspective and that finer detail of understanding of impacts on the most vulnerable people on Earth, which in fact are the next generations coming on Earth every day as we go on with our own work.
Thank you, Elisa. So coming out of a COP, of course, climate change gets a lot of attention. I joke with Alistair that I'm jaded, that freshwater doesn't get just nowhere near the attention that perhaps it deserved. And when we talk about oceans, water, climate change, they're all so closely interconnected. So you would really need this a more cross-cutting vision across this different biomes. And for oceans, I know that there are at least 2 treaties being discussed or negotiated on plastics and areas beyond national jurisdiction. And we often hear the expression treaty congestion. And in fact, Ali, the first time I heard the expression was from you many years ago. So already back then I was learning from Ali. And so Elisa, do we need more treaties on oceans if we already have this fragmented scenario on international environmental law? And if we do need them, why?
No, great question. And I think as lawyers, it's always helpful to keep asking those questions, even if we think we have an answer. But I think for the law of the sea and how the law of the sea should be interpreted in a mutually supportive way with also biodiversity and climate change obligations and human rights obligations, I think the need for a new treaty is very clear. Because we have general rules in the Convention on the Law of the Sea that in theory cover already everything we need to do to protect the ocean and ensure sustainable use of marine resources that can also contribute to the protection of biodiversity and to climate mitigation and adaptation. But the reality is that those rules are not specific enough. And for that reason, the collaboration that's needed and integration of approaches across scales, from the international, regional to local, and across sectors. So if you think about navigation, offshore oil and gas, deep seabed mining, and many other uses, fisheries, etc., we do need more detailed rules that can really guide both international cooperation, but also the development of business activities. So the new treaty, which is being supposedly entering its very final stage of discussions in March next year, unless there'll be further delays, is really needed to provide that more holistic approach, as you were just saying, to what it means to protect the marine environment with all the scientific understanding we have of how, yes, while we have segmenting the ocean into high seas and the areas beyond national jurisdiction, there's ecological connectivity across, not only across the ocean from shores to, the Mariana Trench, but also with the water cycle on land, with how our forests are doing. And all of that just requires, I think, stepping up our international rules and having that architecture institutionally to allow for the more coordinated approaches and more coordinated support to science, for then the science to feed into policy from the international to the local. So that what's called in among the, I guess, specialists as the BBNJ instrument or treaty is going to be essential. However, countries have very different views about how much detail we need there, how much ambition. Some countries have been concerned that maybe a new treaty can provide barriers both to science and to business. And so the crucial issue there is to find a treaty, develop a treaty that will add value to what we have, but will be also conscious of I think, a constructive approach to bring that integrated action and planning across different uses of the ocean and maximizing the efforts in our conservation of marine biodiversity and other the benefits that we derive from healthy marine ecosystems for the climate cycle, the water cycle, and many other aspects. On plastics, I think that's even a more complicated question, and myself as an academic have been wondering whether we needed a new treaty or not for quite a long time. We've had changes across the very complicated international legal systems where certain aspects of the cycle of plastic and prevention of ocean plastics have been addressed. But I think once again, we've realized that we need more integrated approaches and really creating through law a response, an adequate response to the science that shows us the multiple sources of plastic, the multiple impacts on the environment and on human well-being. And in fact, actually, it's been really interesting to see how in 2021, we had a really powerful report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, who's really identified where we actually, because of this integrated approach, we have false solutions that are taking so much attention, and we're not really focusing on real and on lasting solutions. And so he's been really, I think, very clear in saying plastic recycling is not a solution. It's not a viable solution. It's not an environmentally responsible solution. Currently, we're only recycling 9% of global plastic waste. So we really need to move away from that focus on recycling. Of course, some efforts need to be there, but at the same time, we can't think this is the silver bullet, far from it. And even other ways to dispose of plastic create even more chemical pollution and human rights impacts. So I think that really shows that taking the integrated approach and thinking about where are the gaps and the contradictions in our international legal system really serves to focus action on what's really needed, and holding accountable those that are working around the issue, but in a non-integrated way. So I've become a bit of a convert into now the efforts at UNEP that will start most likely next year to develop a treaty on the whole life cycle of plastic, and hopefully taking a human rights approach, because I think that approach helps us as environmental lawyers to think a bit more critically about what we have and whether what we have is doing the trick or not to an acceptable standard. So being a bit more, I think, strict with the margin of discretion we leave to states, and states may leave to business in achieving environmental goals in a more integrated way.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, we had those beautiful images of nature returning to urban areas, but at the same, we were reading about gloves and plastic material reaching as far as Alaska and the Arctic. So it's, yeah, the plastic situation, if we stop to think about it, is quite daunting. And we've had other topics that have been discussed this year, and they got different levels of attention. So I think ecocide was one. We've got a group of experts proposing a definition that it's far from widely agreed upon, still creating some controversy if the definition makes sense and if it's a feasible project. But there is this conversation going, so I guess we need to pay attention to it. Also, biodiversity, the CBD parties met in more of a high-level event condition, not really to make decisions. The meeting continues next year, and that's when the post-global biodiversity framework is meant to be adopted. And the third meeting that happened this year, and maybe should have gotten more attention because some very interesting outcomes from it. And I think Ali can tell us a bit more about the COP of the Sea Water Convention.
Yeah, thanks, Flavia. Yeah, that was a very interesting meeting, and I think, I mean, just to set the context, I mean, that's the 9th meeting. These meetings take place every 3 years under a water convention. And recently, the Water Convention moved from being open to member states of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe to being open to all UN member states. So effectively making this convention a global convention, or open at the global level, alongside the other Water Convention, the 1997 Watercourses Convention. The difference between the two, a few differences, a lot of similarities, but one of the key distinctions is that the Water Convention has this institutional framework. So it has this meeting of the parties, it has a secretariat, it has various working groups working on different things. So formally there are 46 parties, and because it's only just been open to all UN member states, there aren't so many parties yet that are outside the UNEC region. Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, and Togo recently became parties, and you see from the meeting of the parties that there's fair few countries expressed their interests or actually stated that they were in the process of joining. Vietnam, Cote d'Ivoire, Congo, Gambia, Nigeria, Uganda, Namibia, and Iraq. So quite a lot of African countries in the mix, but also some activities going on to raise awareness of the convention across Latin America, Africa, Asia, and I think what's really interesting then is, so you have this meeting of the parties, so you say, okay, well, there are 46 parties, mostly from the UNEC region, but you had more than 100 countries attend, over 500 participants. It was a hybrid, first hybrid meeting of the meeting of the parties. And so already you have, if you're looking at the room, you can't really tell, you're listening, you can't really tell who's a party and who's not a party. The discussion is very open and very much at a global level, and also with the products that were produced. So some of the key outcomes of this meeting included the second report on, as we were talking about, the SDG 6.5.2 indicator on transboundary water cooperation. There was a report on progress in implementing the Water Convention. So these are more assessments. Some guidelines, sort of practical guides, handbooks were developed. There was a practical guide produced on how to develop legal agreements on transboundary waters, a handbook on water allocation, a document around solutions and investments for the water, food, energy ecosystems nexus, and guidance as well on funding and financing transboundary water cooperation. And what I think is really interesting about, in terms of process on these documents, is that they invariably, slightly different process for all of them, but they invariably involved a mixture of parties and non-parties from across the world getting together and drafting and developing the text and drawing in a lot of their experience around transboundary water issues, capturing those in these documents. And so I think it's an interesting time for the Water Convention. It's an interesting meeting of the parties. I think this had happened. You could already see it in the 7th and 8th meeting, but now you can see that there's really a lot of activity happening at a global level underneath the convention and in developing these instruments. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm certainly not aware of such an environment in other multilateral agreements where you have such a, it's quite an interesting maybe it's just sort of a phase, but it's really interesting to see that, as I said before, essentially you can't tell who's a party and who's not a party. You have this global platform which is being used to progress transboundary water cooperation. I think it's, looking at the outcomes and looking at the discussion progress, I think it's been quite effective in that. But without that sort of need, or not waiting until you have formal global membership of the convention. So I think, it's an interesting model, I think, just generally in terms of international environmental governance.
Yeah, I was thinking. So basically what you're saying is that it's not globally ratified yet, but it's already generating global impacts. And that's the interesting thing about working. Sorry, Ali. I guess that's interesting about working with international environmental law, which transboundary waters are an element. The solutions we end up finding are creative, right? Sometimes it's not that strict approach that we may have at the domestic level. Sometimes we just, especially for us lawyers, sometimes it's hard to get creative around the law, but you have to. If you want to bring these countries that are more reticent to sign for whatever reason, but at least if you bring them into the meetings, if you incorporate them into, or allow them to be part of working groups that are developing these guidelines, the guideline on how to negotiate water course agreements, that's international water law. That's not just technical scientific. So you have countries that aren't parties participating in the development of the law under this umbrella, which is what we wanted from a framework convention in the end of the day. And we're getting this from the UNEC. So that's great news. And quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the main thing, as I said, is that if you didn't know, you would assume that it's a global convention with most of 153 countries that share transboundary waters as parties. But in looking at it strictly, on paper, formally, you only have those 46 parties from one region. So I think it's a really interesting model, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves.
Let me ask something to both of you. Ali, I've met your girls, and now they're young adults. And Elisa, you talked about the young generation. So when you think about this new generation, kids, what keeps you up at night? What worries you about the state of international environmental law today? What do we need as international lawyers? What do we need to prioritize and maybe work with our clients, in your case, your students? Elisa, please.
Well, thanks for that question. I think this idea of integrated approaches and how we as teachers, as researchers, as partners in projects of different kinds and advisors, including to the business sector, how we can offer interpretations of the law that really support the integrated thinking, integrated assessments, and integrated action. And so there's a lot that, I think there's a lot of knowledge and understanding within communities of international environmental lawyers. For instance, let's think about the ecosystem approach. That's a concept that's very well understood for the water lawyers, and of course, marine lawyers, and, terrestrial biodiversity lawyers. But we don't necessarily exchange notes enough. And we don't really maybe necessarily work together and teach in ways where we're all, if not equally familiar with the different advances in different parts of international environmental law on the ecosystem approach, and how we can think more in terms of, say, water cycle and carbon cycle, what else we need to do for that. And I think linked to that, what I see more and more in my work is that for how much we have that understanding that human rights are part and parcel of our work in relation to international environmental law, the two communities are still quite distinct. And we have tools and methods and also good ideas that we haven't quite yet fully brought together to make our own work more integrated, and once again support with our interpretations and good practices, business and policymakers to take that I guess, our legal work as part of the science base to then take more integrated decisions, be that at the level of new negotiations, and, beyond the ones you've mentioned, also the international seabed authorities are advancing quite fast on negotiations on new international regulations on deep seabed mining, which may have very big risks for biodiversity and for climate change potentially, and for children's rights. So we ourselves need to integrate more our research efforts and teaching efforts and offer the result of that to policymakers and to business enterprises for them to take action on that integrated view of the law and the science.
Just quickly coming back to Elisa, because you mentioned a lot human rights. Do you think, and we have to learn, even before the environment was recognized at the global level, but I think we do have to learn from the human rights system in terms of how they work on enforcement and reporting. But as a material, as a substantive body of law, do you think we could have human rights as the common thread that brings together climate change, biodiversity, freshwater, oceans, chemicals? So if we need something to integrate, we often think of water as this common thread, but now water becomes one of those things that need to be interconnected. Do you think human rights approaches could play this role?
So that's what I've been testing. So I'm directing a global research cooperation across marine and social sciences, the law and arts, and we've come together, around human rights. So we're trying to test how taking human rights as our entry point is a way to integrate both the different scientific findings, but also then our approach in terms of advising communities, advising NGOs, policymakers at different levels. And what we have seen is that human rights does help to see these interconnections, the interconnections among the SDGs, the interdependencies across the ecosystem, which we're very much part of as humans. And so understanding the human rights impacts is actually one way to use the law and logic to see those interactions and understand the price when we ignore those interactions, because then we have a very concrete sense of who's losing out and in what ways, in terms of health, in terms of life, in terms of food, and which sectors of society might be losing more than others. And so I think that in terms of, accountability is really important, both to understand the implications on when we fail to implement international environmental law, but also, as you were alluding to, it has some legal clarity advantages in terms of understanding what are the minimum floor of obligations that we need to fulfill for appropriate implementation, which often is left a bit vague in international environmental law. And also it brings new mechanisms for interpretation and for monitoring negative impacts that may be in international environmental law we don't have. And so all of that is helpful to hold us to account, I think, for how integrated we are in our understanding and implementation of international environmental law, putting a face on those who we're letting down when we're not doing our job so well.
Yeah. Ali, what do you think?
Yeah,
What keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I think along similar lines to what Elisa has already said. We do need those integrated approaches, and I think, state sovereignty isn't going away, right? So I think we also need to recognize and show how within the international law context that we have, what are the incentives and benefits for countries to cooperate in an integrated way, or to facilitate that integration. And I think you can see, within a transboundary water context, there's some great examples of how states coming together have developed win-win solutions. So it's clear that by working cooperatively, you can protect and benefit from a freshwater ecosystem much more than you could whatever activities you might do at unilaterally. And I think where, and again, sort of along what Elisa has already said, that there's a really important role for the science and the law to interface there and to demonstrate some of the value in taking an ecosystem approach and showing why by protecting ecosystems upstream, you have benefits both upstream and downstream for the users upstream and downstream of a river basin. And I think that works. A lot of work's already been done in that regard, but communicating and sharing it, and I think there's still a lot to do. So I think that's also maybe a message for younger generation and for the students that I work with. I think if they can approach their studies by teasing out, identifying some of these great examples of and developing our knowledge and understanding of what works well and why in interfacing this law and science and promoting this ecosystem thinking, then yeah, I think that would help a lot.
And let me ask you both this: you have both been at this for, Ali, I know at least 20 years, because you kind of started. You were a little ahead of me, but 20 years, right? Thereabout. Yeah. Elisa, a long time as well. Do you guys get the feeling that, because being realistic, we know that the environmental crisis and that works for freshwater as it does for oceans. We know that environmental crisis is not getting better. If anything, it's been getting worse. And climate change, everything we say, as much as we can acknowledge progress, it's not fast enough, like Ali said before, and I'm kind of running out of time. But to think positively, looking back when you started working on international law, do you feel that in negotiations that you follow, in conversations that you have with government officials, and of course we always have those countries that are more reticent for specific issues, but in general, do you feel that states are becoming more comfortable with these issues, more willing, more aware? Are we at least seeing some improvement there, that we can count on this change in perspective to see fast change? We need change in the next 10 years for biodiversity, climate change, all of these issues. So are we now in a mindset among countries in general that is different from what it was 20 years ago, and that we can at least have some faith in this, that things will start to move a little bit faster going forward? Elisa, let me start with you.
Right. So I'll start with maybe a slightly pessimistic view, which is I think states remain still very recalcitrant to take the necessary action, even when at this stage we have a very clear sense of what action is needed, how urgently it's needed, and what dire implications are arising from inaction. I mean, one thing that was really quite jarring at the climate COP26 was that some states were making the exact same statements they were making at COP1. And with good reason, because we, as international community and as individual governments, we haven't done nearly enough. And even if over 25 years, we know so much more and so much better what the cost of the inaction is. And some countries are already facing a lot of those consequences so strongly. So I think governments remain, as Alistair say, national sovereignty is not going anywhere, but the responsibility in exercising that national sovereignty over natural resources needs to step up. Now, unfortunately, governments are not the only ones who can take action and meaningful action. And so this is where thinking around the role of business in being pioneering and having foresight and showing the way, together with civil society, indigenous peoples' movements, other movements, children and young people's movements, all the ideas are out there, the good practices are out there. And I think as long as we can find those pockets of action, good practices, and lead the way, maybe governments may move and just see, well, this is feasible, this may be also good business practice, this may make sense on so many levels, socially, culturally, environmentally, and from an economic perspective. And so for how much in theory they should give the good example, maybe other sectors of the international community, non-state actors need to do that, because governments have been dragging their feet for too long. And that maybe is what really keeps me awake at night more than anything else.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, though, that, and that's a change. I asked about governments, but when you think about stakeholders, my first COP was in 2006. And when we hear today the climate change COP, and I know the EC is also it feels quite comfy because it's so open and so informal. So stakeholders have always had access there. But it does feel that the global citizen movement has gotten much stronger over the last 20 years. So I think governments, at least, are starting to feel a pressure in a way that they didn't a while back. I agree with you, Elisa. That's a very positive point. But Ali, let me go back to you.
Yeah, again, I mean, just on similar lines, I think, I mean, ultimately, we're not getting there fast enough. I think you can look at, certainly some of the discussions that I follow. You can see that you don't have to argue that environment is important, or environment sort of this nice thing to focus on once we deal with everything else. I mean, I think I do think we've got to a stage where there is that widespread recognition of the importance of international environmental law, and more generally taking this ecosystem approach. Yeah, and I suppose the other thing is that I mean, we do have a lot of solutions are already out there. Not all of them, but I think certainly within a water context, and you can see that there are great models and approaches, case studies, examples of how you can take an integrated approach to basin management. But yeah, I think so. The challenge is really to implement the solutions and move from that kind of political recognition to action. And I think that's what really needs to change, or needs to speed up. And yeah, I mean, as you've discussed, I think governments will need a bit of a shift, a bit of a nudge from civil society, from business, to make sure that happens. Yeah.
Yeah. I was watching one of these webinars on the climate outcomes, and one of the negotiators said, we've had enough of paper progress. Now we need outcome progress. We have the decisions, we have the solutions, we need to implement them. Guys, we are also at the end here, so I wanted to give you some space for some final comments, especially thinking into next year and perhaps longer into the future. And what's your advice for things that businesses should be worried about, and what can they do? How can they help? And yeah, just so we can wrap up with some final messages from each of you. Elisa, let me start with you.
Yeah, thanks. And building up what just has been said, and I like the way Ali summarized, how we move from pressure, which is only going so far on governments, and political recognition, which is certainly increased, to action and outcome-oriented action. And I think for me, the critical point, which is again something I've been experimenting, is how we can create partnerships between researchers and the business sector, as well as other colleagues in civil society, to prototype, develop, document those tools that can allow us to make progress and really bring the evidence, bring the tools to governments to say, well, we've done all the homework. You just have to keep this up now and go ahead. And I think one of the key questions at the COP26 was, there's so much money going into climate, so much climate finance, and so much interest from the business community and the large investors in also putting their own resources into climate. And I think one key opportunity thinking water action is climate action, ocean action is climate action. There's an opportunity working with the researchers, because they really are at the forefront of understanding those interactions, to develop those business partnerships and develop the tools that can help everybody else in society really making the progress we need. And we have opportunities. I think there's a lot of interest in international negotiations to hear about progress in these terms, and that could be at the UN Biodiversity Conference of Parties next year, hopefully in late spring. We will have another follow-up UN Oceans Conference, as well as the negotiations you mentioned on plastics and marine biodiversity. So there are open ears there. We need to develop those practical solutions, and I think business and investors can be a huge part of that, to the benefit, to their immediate benefit, as well as the benefit of everybody else. And working with researchers may be one way to do that in a careful way, also with support for due diligence, and also supporting foresight, going where others should go but not quite ready yet.
Interesting. Yeah, so we all need to get out of our comfort zones, the university, our day-to-day law firms work, and the businesses out of the boardrooms, and sort of work together. This interaction between researchers and business, Elisa, that you mentioned, that sounds very, very interesting, because I can see both sides learning and collaborating very productively. So yeah, interesting. Ali, you please.
Yeah, I think from the water side, something that's on the horizon is the UN Water Conference 2023, which will take place in New York in March. So there'll be a lot of regional thematic preparatory meetings taking place next year, sort of leading up to that. And along the lines of what we've discussed, there are three key principles for the water conference. One is inclusiveness, so that's in the conference process. So I think there are lots of opportunities to engage with that preparatory process. Second principle is on concrete action. So as we discussed before, it's not about political statements, but really coming with concrete actions and solutions that can be implemented and upscaled. And then the third principle is around cross-sectoral. So it's not a water conference for the water people, but it should reach out across all sectors. So I think that might be an interesting opportunity and an interesting thing to follow throughout next year, to see how we galvanize all the momentum and support around around water, and how that leads into the 2023 and beyond.
Excellent. Well, I would ask you both to keep us informed, because I'm sure VX and Milaré would be interested in helping in any way we can. And this work that you're doing is so important, so interesting. And this has been great. I wish eventually we can do it in person, have a glass of wine, and see each other, right, Elisa? Because you never met in person. Ali, I haven't seen in ages, although you look the same, Ali, exactly the same.
Too kind.
So thank you so much for accepting this invitation. This has been fun. I enjoyed a lot, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.